Looking for a heartwarming children's book with a powerful message?
Being Me is the Best Thing to Be by Judy Erb tells the story of Honey, a curious little turtle who learns that being herself is the very best thing to be. It's a wonderful read for children, parents, and grandparents celebrating self confidence and self acceptance.
You can purchase this book on BookBaby, Amazon, or Barnes& and Noble.
If you want an autographed copy, you can email Judy directly at jerbauthor@gmail.com with your mailing address and who you'd like it personalized to.
All of these links are in the show notes, but make sure you get your copy today. Welcome to the podcast. I'm William.
And I'm Kat,
And that makes this Info on the Go.
feeding your curiosity wherever you go.
Now, I got raised.
You did it yourself.
Yeah. So I got this idea from one of our old sponsors. You know who you are. If you want us back, we would love to have you back. And have you ever heard of this before we started this?
No, but I'm genuinely intrigued.
I mean, this is some pretty wild stuff that we're going to talk about. And hopefully you read the title, Premonitions Bureau. And yeah, the actual title is Premonitions Bureau, colon, did people really know the future? So you know
Let's
what?
get into it.
Yeah. Hey Kat, why don't you start it off?
I don't have to imagine this has happened to me, but anyway, imagine waking up from a dream with a strange and powerful feeling that something terrible is going to happen. You don't know exactly what will happen, where it will happen, or even when it will happen. But the feeling is strong enough that you decide to write it down. Then, several days later, a disaster occurs that seems remarkably similar to what you described. Was it a coincidence? Was it your mind recognizing something you weren't consciously aware of? Or could you somehow have received a warning about an event before it happened?
This unusual question, or questions, well, it became the focus of a fascinating British experiment known as the Premonitions Bureau. Rather than simply dismissing people's stories about strange dreams, visions, and feelings of superstition, the Bureau, it attempted to collect these reports and record them before the events supposedly predicted ever occurred. So the idea was simple, but potentially groundbreaking. If people could truly receive warnings about future disasters, perhaps those warnings could be documented and studied before anyone knew what was going to happen.
Hmm. The story of the Premonitions Bureau raises a question that is still difficult to answer. Were some people experiencing genuine glimpses of the future, or were they experiencing coincidences that only seemed meaningful after a disaster occurred? And to find out, we have to go back to one of Britain's most tragic disasters and to the strange reports that followed it.
To understand the Premonitions Bureau, we first have to go back to October 21st, 1966, which is really not that far back. And we're going to go back to a small Welsh mining village of Aberfan. South Wales had a long history of coal mining, and communities like Aberfan had grown around the industry. Coal provided jobs and supported families, but mining also left behind enormous piles of waste material known as spoil tips. These piles were often located on the hillside above mining communities, and over time, they could become enormous structures of loose rock, coal dust, and other materials that had been removed during the mining process.
On the morning of October 21st, 1966, disaster struck Aberfan. After days of heavy rain, a section of a coal spoil tip became unstable. The saturated material suddenly gave way and began moving rapidly down the mountainside. What followed was an enormous avalanche of coal waste and water that swept into the village below. The flow struck Pantglass Junior School and nearby homes, burying buildings beneath tons of material. The disaster killed 144 people, including 116 children, making it one of the most devastating disasters in modern Welsh history.
So the tragedy shocked Britain, as it should. Aberfan was a close-knit mining community, and the fact that so many children were among the victims made the disaster extremely difficult for the public to comprehend. Rescue worker, I gotta stop saying. You know how many times I had to edit, you know.
Oh no. So you're doing this for your later self.
Yeah,
Sorry, future William.
raised. Rescue workers, local residents, volunteers, and emergency personnel worked through debris in desperate attempts to find survivors. The disaster also raised serious questions about the safety of spoil tips and whether enough attention had been paid to the danger they posed to the communities located below them. As we talked about, these spoil tips were at the top of these communities. And remember, it's all this trash and smaller debris.
But after the tragedy, another very different story began to emerge. People from Britain and elsewhere came forward claiming that they had experienced unusual dreams, feelings, or visions before the disaster occurred. Some believed that they had somehow received a warning that something terrible was going to happen in Aberfan. These accounts were not evidence that the future had actually been seen, but they were intriguing enough to attract the attention of psychiatrist John Barker.
Barker became interested in whether these reports could be investigated rather than simply accepted or dismissed. If people really had these warnings before the disaster, he wondered if whether those experiences could be recorded and studied. That question would eventually lead to the creation of the Premonitions Bureau, which was an unusual attempt to find out whether the future could somehow leave clues before it ever happened.
Now, who was John Barker? Like I said, he was a British psychiatrist who became interested in the reports of apparent premonitions that surfaced after the Aberfan disaster. Now, what made Barker's approach unusual was that he wasn't simply interested in ghosts, fortune tellings, or stories about people who claim to have psychic abilities. He wanted to investigate the claims in a more systematic way. Instead of asking whether a person felt that they had predicted an event, Barker was interested in whether there was evidence showing that the prediction had actually been made before the event occurred.
The reports surrounding Aberfan gave him, well, the best opportunity to explore that question. After the disaster, Barker encountered accounts from people who said they had experienced dreams, visions, strong feelings, uh, all about what was about to happen in Aberfan. So the problem was very obvious. Once a disaster has already occurred, it becomes much easier to interpret an earlier dream or unusual feeling as a prediction. A person might remember details differently, or an original vague dream might take on a much more unique meaning after the event. Barker understood that problem, which is why recording predictions before an event occurred was so important to him.
Barker eventually worked with journalist Peter Fairley, and together they developed the idea for what became the Premonitions Bureau. Basic concept was surprisingly simple. People who believed they had experienced a premonition could report it, and the information could be recorded and dated before the event supposedly predicted took place. The Bureau could then compare the original report with what actually happened.
That approach didn't prove that premonitions were real, but it addressed one of the biggest problems with investigating premonitions. If someone predicts an event after it has already happened, there's really no way to know exactly what they originally said. Recording the prediction beforehand, it creates that record that can be checked later. In theory, that could reduce the effects of hindsight bias, the tendency to look back at an event and believe that it was more of a predictable than it actually was.
So, for Barker, that was the important distinction. He wasn't simply asking people to believe in premonitions, he was asking whether their claims could be documented and tested. If people really were receiving warnings about future disasters, then perhaps those warnings would show up in the records before the disasters happened. And if they didn't, that would be important evidence too. So, the Premonitions Bureau was essentially an attempt to turn an extraordinary claim into something that could at least be investigated, sort of.
Yeah. And, Welcome to the Premonitions Bureau. That was the sign on their front door. No, it didn't land.
Was it?
No, it really wasn't. I mean, it can be. I think it would have been a good one.
I mean, I suppose.
All right, so how did the Premonitions Bureau actually work? The basic idea was fairly straightforward. People who believed they had experienced a premonition could report it to the Bureau. Their experiences could take on many different forms. Some people described dreams or visions, while others reported strong feelings, unusual sensations, or a sense that something was about to happen. Some reports involved direct warnings about accidents or disasters, while others were much less precise. The goal was to collect these accounts and create a record that could later be compared with real world events.
But almost immediately, the Bureau faced a major problem. People have countless dreams, feelings, and hunches every day, and most of them don't lead to anything significant. If someone reports 100 predictions and 99 of them never happen, those failed predictions are easy to forget. But if one prediction appears to be true, that single success can seem extraordinary. This creates a difficult question. How do you determine whether that apparent success was actually meaningful?
Imagine someone reports, I have a feeling there will be a train accident. If a train accident occurs somewhere in Britain a few days later, it might seem impressive, but Britain had thousands of trains operating every day, and accidents, although relatively uncommon, they were not impossible in events, right? So, so were the people actually predicting the accident, or did a broad prediction eventually match something that was bound to happen somewhere, somehow, anyway?
Well, the same problem applies to predictions about earthquakes, fires, plane crashes, deaths, storms, and other disasters. The more general the prediction, the easier it becomes to find something afterward that appears to match it. A statement like, something terrible will happen, is almost certain to be followed by some unfortunate event somewhere. A much more impressive prediction would contain specific details that were recorded beforehand, such as a particular location, type of event, and approximate date.
This is why the timing and wording of a prediction mattered so much to the Premonitions Bureau. The question wasn't simply whether something looked like a prediction after the fact. The real question was whether the original report recorded before the event, if it contained unique information to make the apparent match genuinely unlikely to be a coincidence. In other words, they're taking out the guesswork of, hey, a train's going to crash in East Britain. They're looking for fact. They're looking for like unique facts and details, right?
How many people are going to be dead? Like, what's the devastation?
Approximate location. Okay.
Right.
Okay, I got you.
That is where the story of the Bureau becomes especially interesting. Among all the dreams, feelings, and predictions that were reported, there were some accounts that seemed far more specific and unsettling than a simple feeling that something had bad might happen. Those are the cases that attracted the most attention, and they're the ones we need to examine next.
Kat, something bad's gonna happen if we don't take a break here. I have this feeling.
My throat's going to get dry.
Coke.
Pepsi.
We'll be right back.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Technology is everywhere, but sometimes you just want someone to break it down in plain English for you. That's where Fresh from Cash comes in. Created by IT professional Joel Faulkner, Fresh from Cash, it delivers tech news, how-tos, and straightforward explainers for everyday technology users. No confusing jargon, no assumption that you already know how everything works, just practical information that actually makes sense. Wondering what a passkey is? Why your computer suddenly feels slow, how to spot a phishing email, or whether you really need backups? Join Joel every Tuesday. You can get the latest tech tips and insights delivered directly to your inbox, absolutely free. So if technology sometimes feels like it should have come with a better manual, check out Fresh from Cache, and that's spelled CACHE. Fresh from Cache, tech news that makes sense. You can find the link in the show notes. So now that we're back, this is where the story of the Premonitions Bureau becomes especially intriguing. The Bureau collected hundreds of reports, and most of them went absolutely nowhere. But a small number, it had enough unique information to make people stop and take notice. And to understand why these cases attracted so much attention, it helps to examine them like a detective would. What exactly was predicted? When was the prediction recorded? What happened afterward? And perhaps most importantly, how closely did the prediction actually match the event?
One of the most striking cases involved Alan Hencher, a London telephone operator who became one of the Bureau's most frequently discussed correspondents. On March 21st, 1967, Hencher contacted the Bureau and reported a premonition about an airplane crash. According to the account recorded by the Bureau, he described an aircraft going down over mountains and predicted a death toll of either 123 or 124 people. About a month later, on April 20th, a Globe Air Bristol Britannia aircraft crashed into a hillside near Nicosia Airport in Cyprus. The aircraft was carrying 130 people, and 124 ultimately died. The basic details were striking: an airplane crash, mountainous terrain, and a remarkably close prediction of the number of fatalities.
That is kind of eerie.
Indeed.
Okay. Now, if we stop there, that story sounds extraordinary. But let's put on our detective hats just for a moment. The first question is whether Hincher's predictions were genuinely recorded before the crash. That is really important because a prediction reconstructed after an event would be much less convincing. The historical count says the Bureau, well, it had recorded his warnings beforehand. But there's another question. How unusual was the prediction? Plane crashes were certainly not everyday events, but they were also not impossible. And even a remarkably close number can occur by chance when enough predictions are being made. The Bureau, again, was receiving hundreds of reports, most of which failed to produce a recognizable match. So the question isn't simply, did Hincher get one right? It's how unlikely was the particular combination of details considering all the predictions that didn't come true? You're supposed to go, ah,
Uh,
you don't sound convincing. We're a theatrical podcast.
aha!
Ah, there you go. My dear Watson.
Hensher appeared to have another unsettling success later that year. He reported a prediction involving a crowded train and a large number of deaths in November 1967. The Hither Green rail crash occurred in southeast London when a train derailed, killing 49 people. Historical accounts of the Bureau described Hensher as having predicted a derailment involving a train traveling toward London and a death toll that matched the eventual number of fatalities. The timing of the prediction was close enough to attract considerable attention.
Again, though, we we really have to stop and slow down before declaring that Hincher had somehow seen the future. A train crash was a conceivable event in an era when Britain's rail network was enormous and accidents they definitely occurred. The more interesting question is how much information Hincher supplied beforehand. Was the prediction unique enough that we could have recognized the event before it happened? Or did later reports make the original prediction sound more precise than it actually was? That distinction is really critical when investigating claims of pre-recognition.
Another important figure was Kathleen Middleton, piano teacher who became one of the Bureau's most active correspondents. Middleton reported a number of premonitions, and historical accounts credit her with several apparent matches. Among the events associated with her predictions were disasters involving ships, floods, spaceflight, and political violence. She and Hensher became particularly important to the Bureau because the disproportionate share of the predictions that appeared to come true came from these two people. One later analysis of the Bureau's records found that out of 723 predictions collected, only 18 were judged to have come true to some degree, with 12 of those associated with Middleton and Hensher.
So they were productive, right? In this bureau.
Sort of.
Okay. That statistic gives us something important to think about. If hundreds of predictions were collected, but only a relatively small number appeared to, well, match later events, perhaps those successful predictions were genuinely unusual. But there's another possible explanation. Maybe Middleton and Hincher were simply making far more predictions than everyone else, giving them more opportunities to produce a hit. Or perhaps their predictions were sometimes broad enough that later events could be interpreted as matches. Without knowing the exact wording, timing, and conditions surrounding every prediction, it's really difficult to determine just how strong the evidence really was for these two.
There was also the prediction involving Torrey Canyon, a huge oil tanker that ran aground off the coast of Cornwall in March 1967, causing one of Britain's worst maritime oil spills. The Bureau received predictions concerning disasters at sea, and the Torrey Canyon became one of the events later discussed in connection with his correspondence. But this is a good example of why we have to be careful. Saying that someone predicted a ship disaster is very different from predicting a particular tanker, location, date, and circumstances. The closer the original prediction comes to those specific details, the more interesting the case becomes.
And then there is perhaps the strangest part of the entire story. Some of the Bureau's correspondents began having premonitions about John Barker himself. Barker had started the project because he wanted to investigate whether premonitions could potentially warn people about future disasters. But eventually, some of the people he had been studying began reporting warnings concerning concerning his future. This created an uncomfortable situation. If Barker took their predictions seriously, he had to consider whether something might happen to him. If he dismissed them, he risked applying a different standard to predictions about himself than he had applied to predictions about everyone else.
So, what should we make of these cases? That's where the mystery becomes more complicated. Some of the predictions appear surprisingly specific, particularly the reported prediction involving the Cyprus plane crash and the number of deaths. Others are much harder to evaluate because the original wording is less clear or because later accounts may emphasize the similarities while giving less attention to the failed predictions.
And that brings us to the central problem facing the Premonitions Bureau. It wasn't enough to find a few amazing coincidences. The Bureau had to determine whether those successes occurred more often than we could expect by chance. In other words, were these people actually predicting the future, or were they simply producing enough predictions that eventually a few of them were, bound to look remarkably accurate? And we're going to leave that question hanging for just a moment because the next part of the story takes us away from the individual predictions and into something even more fascinating: the psychology of why humans are so good at finding patterns after something has already happened.
At this point, it helps to step away from the individual stories and look at the science behind them. The idea of predicting the future is fascinating, but human psychology gives us several reasons why an event can appear predictable even when there's no actual warning. One of the most important concepts is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is our tendency to notice and remember information that supports an idea we already have while paying less attention to information that doesn't exist.
Think about how many dreams you have in a typical year. You might dream about an accident, a friend you haven't seen in years, a strange place, or something completely impossible. Most of those dreams disappear from your memory within days, or if you're like me, within hours of waking up. But imagine that you dream about an airplane crash and then a few days later, you hear about a real airplane accident on the news. Suddenly, that dream becomes memorable. You might think, I dreamed about this before it ever happened. Dozens or hundreds of other dreams that didn't match anything, well, you've already forgotten.
Pretty much. I woke up one morning and said something bad's going to happen today, and the paint booth I was working in caught on fire.
I woke up one morning and said I'm gonna not be able to pronounce or make functional sentences on a podcast while recording. Oh
Oh,
wait, that happens every time we record.
yeah, I don't think that was a premonition. I think that was just bound to happen.
Gee,
Sorry.
Kat, thanks for the vote of confidence you gave me. Like, Let's see
No,
if I
no offense.
little taken.
If I didn't pick on you, I wouldn't care about you.
Really?
Yeah,
Dang. Okay. Well, I feel extremely special, I guess.
you should.
Okay.
This creates what we might call the hits and misses problem. Imagine that. So imagine someone takes 1,000 predictions about the future. Most of them don't come true, but even if a few predictions happen to match, but even
Right.
right. But if even a few predictions happen to match real events, those successful predictions can seem extraordinary. The human mind naturally focuses on the hits. The misses don't make nearly as interesting a story.
Coincidence? It also plays a major role in this. With enough predictions and enough real world events taking place, some matches are, well, they're just bound to happen. Everyday people are involved in accidents, storms occur, buildings catch fire, transportation accidents happen, and people become sick or die. If someone makes enough broad predictions, eventually one of those predictions is likely to resemble something that actually happens.
But the wording of the prediction matters enormously. Imagine someone writes, there will be trouble involving water. That could eventually be connected to a flood, a shipwreck, a hurricane, a boating accident, or even a plumbing problem. The prediction sounds impressive only after someone has chosen which event it supposedly predicted. But if we didn't know what was going to happen beforehand, would we have known what the prediction meant?
And that's where hindsight bias enters the picture. Once we know the outcome, events they can appear much more predictable than they actually were. A vague statement it can suddenly seem to have enough unique information because we already know what happened. Someone might originally write, I see a terrible accident involving a vehicle. After a bus crash occurs, that prediction might be remembered as a prediction of the bus crash, even if the original statement never mentioned a bus.
There's also the problem of selective memory. Human memory isn't a perfect recording of the past. We reconstruct memories, and later experiences can influence how we remember earlier ones. A person who has a strange dream before a major event may remember the dream in greater detail afterward, especially if other people begin asking questions about it. That doesn't necessarily mean the person is being dishonest. They may gradually believe they remembered the dream exactly as it happened.
And this is why the Premonitions Bureau attempt to record predictions before events occurred was so important. If the original prediction could be preserved with a date and exact wording, investigators could compare it with the later event without relying entirely on someone's memory. The question becomes much more objective. What did the person actually write or report before the event ever happened?
But even that doesn't completely solve the problem. Suppose a person makes a prediction that is remarkably close to a future event. We still have to ask how many other predictions they made that didn't come true. We also need to know how many other people were making predictions during the same period. If hundreds or thousands of people are making predictions, some extraordinary matches are going to occur simply by chance.
And this is where statistically proving precognition becomes extremely difficult. To establish that people can actually perceive future events, researchers would need controlled experiments in which predictions are recorded in advance. The possible outcomes are clearly defined, and the results can be repeated. The successful predictions would have to occur much greater than they would if chance were involved. So this is really a much higher standard than finding one eerie coincidence, basically.
That's an important distinction for the Premonitions Bureau. The interesting question isn't simply, did someone predict something that later happened? There are documented cases where the answer appears to be yes. The much harder question is, did they predict it often enough, specifically enough, and under controlled enough conditions to show that something beyond coincidence was happening?
That question transforms the Premonitions Bureau from a strange story about dreams and disasters into a genuine scientific puzzle. Because whether premonitions are real or not, the investigation forces us to confront something we encounter every day. Our brains are incredibly good at finding patterns, and sometimes they can find patterns even when there may be nothing at all. Kat, I think before we get into the next segment of the science and all that, I predicted Coke in my future and yours as well.
I think your prediction is wrong. I'm getting a Pepsi.
Cherry Coke. We'll be right back.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Ready to turn an ordinary day into an unforgettable adventure? Check out QR Hunter. It lets you create custom treasure hunts with reusable QR code tiles. You can personalize clues, puzzles, photo challenges. You can do it all in just a few minutes. It's perfect for birthday parties, family game nights, classrooms, parks, team building events, or if you just want to have family fun. The free QR Hunter app, it works with any smart device. The adventure, it never really ends. You can search for QR Hunter on Amazon, or you can simply click the link in the show notes. But let the adventure start today.
So now that we're back,
I have a question now that we're back.
okay,
Did you actually get a Coke?
no,
Cherry Coke? Vanilla
no,
Coke? Any kind of Coke?
no Coke.
Wait, you're in the South, so if you're drinking any kind of soda, it's a Coke. Sorry. So are you
Well,
drinking any kind of soda?
it's a Pepsi.
But it's a Coke here in the South. Sorry.
I'm drinking a Pepsi Cola.
I gotta teach you about Georgia.
Pepsi.
Okay, you can carry on. I will not interrupt you anymore, I promise. If people only knew how much I did that to you, I am sorry, not sorry. You pick on me, so there you go.
It's because I
If
care
I
about you. I'm telling you. It's just
if I
because I care.
if I did interrupt you, I wouldn't care.
That's fair. So anyway, could precognition actually be possible? Precognition is the claimed ability to obtain information about an event before that event happens. It is often grouped with other forms of extrasensory perception, or ESP, such as telepathy and clairvoyance. For decades, researchers have tried to determine whether these abilities are real, using experiments designed to separate genuine effects from coincidence, guessing, and psychological bias.
Some of the earliest modern experiments involve simple tests. Participants might be asked to guess which symbol would appear on a card, identify a hidden image, or predict which of several possible outcomes would occur. Researchers would then compare those results with what would be expected from an ordinary chance. Later experiments became more sophisticated, including attempts to test whether people could identify information about random selected images or events before they were presented.
Precognition has also been studied in experiments where participants attempt to predict a randomly selected target. The basic principle is important. The target is determined independently of the participant's response, and the prediction is recorded whether the target is revealed. In theory, this creates a fair test because neither the participant nor the researcher should know the answer in advance.
But this is where science becomes demanding. If some people perform better than chance in one experiment, that result is interesting, but it isn't enough to establish that precognition exists. There could be an unnoticed flaw in the experiment. Statistics, there's variations, unconscious clues, or simply an unusual result that occurred by chance.
To convince scientists that humans could actually obtain information from the future, researchers would need something much stronger. The effect would have to appear repeatedly under carefully controlled conditions. Independent researchers should be able to conduct the same experiment and obtain similar results. The methods would need to be clearly defined in advance. The researchers would need to account for failures, predictions, as well as successful ones.
That last point, it's especially important. If you run an experiment enough times, eventually you will get unusual results purely by chance. Science, therefore, asks not whether something happened once, but whether the results occur more often than chance would responsibly predict.
And that's the real challenge for precognition. One person making one astonishing prediction is certainly fascinating. It may be difficult to explain, but science needs more than an extraordinary story. It needs a pattern that can be measured, tested, repeated, and independently verified.
So when we look back at the Premonitions Bureau, the question isn't simply whether some of its predictions were eerie. Some certainly were. The bigger scientific question is whether those successes represented something beyond coincidence and whether the same effect could be demonstrated again under controlled conditions. So far, that is where the evidence becomes much harder to interpret. And that brings us back to the Premonitions Bureau itself and what eventually happened to Barker's unusual experiment.
So, what happened to John Barker and the Premonitions Bureau? Well, for a time, the idea seemed remarkably ambitious. If people were really experiencing warnings about future disaster, Barker believed that collecting those reports before events occurred might provide a way to investigate the phenomenon. But turning that idea into convincing scientific evidence proved far more difficult than anyone could have expected.
One of the biggest problems was simply gathering reliable information. The Bureau received reports from people describing dreams, feelings, visions, and predictions, but those reports varied greatly in detail. Some were quite, unique, while others were so vague that it was difficult to determine what event they were actually predicting. A statement such as, I feel there was a disaster involving water could potentially match dozens of different events. The more general the prediction, the harder it became to determine whether the eventual match was meaningful.
There was also the challenge of verifying exactly when a prediction had been made. For a premonition to be scientifically interesting, the prediction needed to exist before the event. If the wording was recorded only after the event occurred, there was always the possibility that the prediction had been remembered differently or interpreted in light of what had already happened. This made accurate records and reliable dates extremely important.
And then came the problem of the predictions that never came true. The Bureau, well, it could collect many reports, but most did not correspond to a recognizable future event. This isn't necessarily surprising. People consistently have dreams and unusual feelings, and most of them lead nowhere. But scientifically, those failures cannot simply be ignored. They have to be included alongside the apparent successes.
This created a difficult balancing act. A handful of predictions could appear remarkably accurate, but thousands of unsuccessful predictions could make those successes much less extraordinary. Without a reliable way to calculate how often these apparent hits should occur by chance, it was difficult to determine whether the Bureau was uncovering something genuinely unusual.
There was also a larger scientific problem. Even if a prediction appeared to come true, the result needed to be reproducible. Scientists would want to see the same phenomenon demonstrated repeatedly under controlled conditions, preferably by independent researchers. The Premonitions Bureau, it never really developed the kind of consistent, repeatable evidence that would establish precognition as a scientifically accepted phenomenon.
Well, Barker's project therefore never became the revolutionary scientific institution that some people hoped it might become. The Bureau eventually disappeared, and the systematic investigation of premonitions did not produce a definitive answer about whether people could actually foresee future events.
But perhaps the most interesting part is that the question didn't disappear with the Bureau. People still report dreams that seem to predict events, sudden feelings that something is wrong, and strange experiences that only make sense after something happens. Modern technology has also given us something Barker's Bureau could only dream about: the ability to record information instantly, preserve it permanently, and analyze enormous amounts of data.
So perhaps the Premonitions Bureau didn't solve the mystery of precognition, but it did leave us with a fascinating question, one that we can investigate far more carefully today than Barker could in the 1960s.
Now, that brings the story of the Premonitions Bureau into the modern world. Imagine that someone tells you they had a vivid dream about a plane crash, an earthquake, a hurricane, or some other disaster. What should we do with that information? Should we immediately dismiss it as coincidence, or should we record it to see if it happens?
Well, today, Technology gives us a way to investigate that question much more carefully than John Barker could in the 60s. We can create a modern version of the Premonitions Bureau online, where every prediction is automatically recorded with an exact date and time. A person could submit their prediction, and the original wording could be preserved so it couldn't quietly be changed later.
And that distinction is extremely important. Imagine someone witnesses, I believe there will be a major earthquake in California within the next 2 weeks. The prediction is automatically timestamped and stored. If an earthquake occurs, investigators can go back to the original statement and compare that with what actually happened. If nothing happens, that prediction remains a documented miss rather than simply disappearing from the record.
The system could also publish predictions publicly. That would create an additional layer of accountability. Once a prediction is online, anyone could see exactly what was said and when it was posted. There would be no way to rely on someone's memory months later, and there would be much less opportunity to change the wording after an event occurs.
So, in other words, basically what we're saying is the internet is ever growing. And if you make a prediction or have a prediction and you put it out there, we could create some kind of database for successful and unsuccessful predictions for researchers to examine. Maybe that's the real lesson to take away from the Premonitions Bureau. The question isn't whether we should automatically believe a strange prediction, it's whether we can create a system where the prediction is recorded first, and only then do we wait to see what happens.
So, did the people who contacted the Premonitions Bureau really see the future? There is no simple answer. Some of the reported premonitions were uncannily specific, while others were vague enough that they could easily have been coincidences. And for every prediction that seemed to come true, there were many others that never did.
Our own psychology also makes the mystery harder to solve. We are naturally good at finding patterns, remembering the hits, and forgetting the misses. That doesn't mean every premonition was meaningless. It simply means extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Maybe the people who contacted the Premonitions Bureau really did glimpse the future. Maybe they experienced coincidences so remarkable that they seemed like prophecies. Or maybe there's something about the human mind that we still just don't understand.
But here's the question we'll leave you with. If you dreamed tonight that something terrible was going to happen tomorrow, would you ignore it or would you tell someone? Mic drop.
Right.
This one was unique.
It, for sure. I mean, and I guess we'll never really know, you know?
Well, I mean, I think, the United States had its own thing like this, and I think we're going to dive into that in a later episode, but I never knew about the Premonitions Bureau.
No, that was a new one for me too.
Yeah, and I didn't know that they had a couple of people making extraordinary predictions, so to speak.
That was pretty cool. There
Yeah.
was, some kind of possible hope, sort of.
Anyway, yeah, I thought this one was extremely interesting. I think that if there was some kind of database for people making predictions that could be stored and examined by researchers, that would really bring John Barker's original Premonitions Bureau back to life.
For sure.
I mean, we have the technology to do it.
Absolutely. We just have to have some people enough willing to pay for it.
If you would like to
So,
support this podcast, tell a friend and help get the word out.
if you'd like to support the show, you can do so at Patreon. Take advantage of our sponsors. Those links are in the show notes.
And as always, Kat and I want to say thank you.
For sure. Whether you've been listening from day one or just tuning in, thank you.
Make sure you join the Facebook group at Info on the Go,
Over there, you can get to know us.
or just to ask us a question.
But whatever you do, follow us wherever you get your podcast.
You can send us some fan mail using the link in the show notes, but we would really prefer you to leave us a review.
Yes. And leaving that review really does help others find us. You can also email us directly at
infoonthegopodcast@gmail.com.
all of that is in the show notes. Till next time.
Stay curious. I predict that we're about to end this podcast with some awesome music and maybe an ad.
I guess the world may never know. Let's find out.
How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop?
3 in a crunch.
Hey, listeners, ready to transform your sleep? Cozy Earth is all about lasting luxury and comfort. Their bamboo sheets have been called the world's softest sheets, cooling, moisture wicking, and unbelievably soft. And I can tell you they get better with every wash. And they have a 100-night sleep trial and a 10-year warranty.
But it doesn't stop there. They have bath, sleepwear, loungewears, and even skincare. Free shipping on orders of $50 or more.
Make sure you go to cozyearth.com, use our code INFOGO at checkout to save 21% off. You can find all of this in the show notes.